The Mafia boss thought he could use a language she didn't know as a weapon. He leaned back in the gold-accented chair, smirked, and switched to an archaic, jagged Italian dialect. He thought it was a secret code. He used it to humiliate her. He mocked her upbringing. He insulted her intelligence. And then, he gave an order that was a trap. His associates at the table grinned, leaning in to watch the simple waitress crumble. The restaurant held its breath. Then, Sharon Hopkins spoke. She didn't just answer. She used his exact dialect, but with a precision that made his own speech sound like a child's. She corrected his grammar. She exposed the dark history of the dish he ordered. And in that moment, the most dangerous man in the room went completely silent. Because the woman in the black blazer wasn't just a waitress. She was a specialist who understood his secrets better than his own men did. And she was done being invisible. The air inside the restaurant didn't just smell of saffron and expensive vintage wine. It smelled of iron. Of old, heavy influence. This was a place where silence was bought and loyalty was tested over 5-course meals. And when Vittorino Venezia arrived, the atmosphere shifted like a physical weight. The clinking of silver against china died down. The waiters stepped back into the shadows. The room didn't just acknowledge him, it surrendered to him. Vittorino didn't just sit. He claimed the space. Sharp, 3-piece suit. Tattoos peeking from beneath his cuffs like warnings. A dominant, relaxed posture that told everyone he owned the floor beneath their feet. His confidence wasn't just wealth, it was the absolute certainty that he was the apex predator in the room. Tonight, Vittorino wasn't looking for a deal. He was looking for a target. He was looking to feel powerful at someone else's expense. Across the room stood Sharon J. Hopkins. Blonde hair pinned back in a bun so tight it felt like a mask. Standing upright. Professional. Cautious. To Vittorino, she was part of the furniture. A low-status servant who was there to be used and discarded. He saw her notepad. He saw her silence. He saw an easy victory. What he didn't know was that Sharon had spent her life decoding the world's most dangerous secrets. She spoke the languages of kings, spies, and killers. And tonight, she was tired of being the only person in the room who knew how to keep her mouth shut. Vittorino was about to learn that sometimes, the person you humiliate is the only one who can save you, or destroy you. Sharon smoothed the front of her white shirt, the fabric stiff from homestarch and repeated washings. She stood before the silvered glass of the employee restroom, her fingers working with practiced, clinical precision to secure her blonde hair. Every strand was tucked, pinned, and lacquered into a bun so tight it felt like a physical anchor, holding her secrets in place. This was her armor. As long as she looked the part of the invisible, impeccable server, the ghosts of her past couldn't find her. Stepping out into the dining room of Loro, the transition was seamless. The restaurant was a cathedral of gold leaf and warm amber light, designed to make the wealthy feel like gods and the staff feel like shadows. Sharon moved through the space with a grace that was too refined for a waitress, a remnant of the years she had spent walking the marble halls of embassies in Rome and Brussels. She carried her notepad like a shield, her eyes downcast just enough to be respectful but sharp enough to catch every detail. The weight of the shift already sat heavy in her chest, but it wasn't from the physical labor. It was the mental tally she kept running in the back of her mind, a ledger of survival. The rent for their cramped apartment was 3 days overdue. Her younger sister's university tuition had been hiked again, and the latest medical bill for her father's specialized care sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking clock. To the diners, she was a nameless facilitator of their comfort. To her family, she was the only thing standing between them and the street. Sharon, table 4 needs more sparkling water. Move it, the floor manager hissed, his voice a sharp contrast to the soft Vivaldi playing over the speakers. Sharon nodded, her expression a mask of calm. Of course, Marcus. She moved toward the bar, her mind momentarily drifting to the life she had lost. 3 years ago, she had been a senior linguistic analyst, a woman who could listen to a muffled recording of a Sicilian dockworker and identify not just the crime, but the specific village where the speaker was born. She had been a rising star until the security breach happened, a calculated betrayal by a superior who needed a scapegoat. They hadn't just fired her, they had stripped her of her credentials, blacklisted her from the industry, and left her with a mountain of legal debt. Now, her brilliance was a liability. To show her hand was to invite questions she couldn't answer. So, she played the part of the simple waitress, with a blonde bun and a quiet voice. As she refilled the glasses at table 4, she felt the familiar sting of a patron's dismissal. A man didn't even look up as she poured, treating her hand as if it were a mechanical extension of the bottle. She didn't mind the invisibility anymore, in fact, she relied on it. If they didn't see her, they couldn't hurt her. But as the heavy front doors of Loro swung open and a sudden chill swept through the entryway, Sharon felt a primal shiver of recognition. The man who entered didn't just walk in, he invaded. The air seemed to tighten, the chatter of the room dropping by several decibels. Sharon didn't need to look at his tattoos or his sharp three-piece suit to know who he was. She recognized the cadence of his movement before he even spoke, the unmistakable, predatory rhythm of the Sicilian underworld. Vittorino Venezia had arrived. And as she adjusted her notepad, Sharon knew the quiet safety of her invisibility was about to be tested to its breaking point. Vittorino Venezia didn't just sit at table 1, he dismantled the room's composure. His associates, a pair of younger men with hungry eyes and expensive watches, flanked him like guard dogs, but their gaze was fixed on the man in the center. Vittorino leaned back, his charcoal three-piece suit pulling tight across his broad shoulders, while his fingers, adorned with a heavy gold signet ring, drummed a rhythmic, taunting beat on the white linen tablecloth. He looked up as Sharon approached, his smirk widening into something that felt less like a greeting and more like a dare. "Good evening," Sharon said, her voice a practiced melody of neutrality. She held her notepad at the ready, her spine a straight line of professional defiance. "Welcome to Loro. May I start you with an aperitif, or are you ready to order?" Vittorino didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to make the person standing feel smaller, more desperate to please. He glanced at her name tag, Sharon, and then up at her face, his eyes scanning her features with a cold, analytical amusement. "The girl speaks English, presumably," Vittorino said, turning to his companions. He spoke with a thick, standard Italian accent, but his tone was dripping with condescension. "But does she understand the soul of the menu? Or is she just here to carry the plates?" His associates laughed, a sharp, sycophantic sound that echoed against the gold-leafed ceiling. Sharon kept her eyes fixed on her notepad. She had heard variations of this 1,000 times. She waited, her breathing shallow and controlled. Then, the game shifted. Vittorino leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low, guttural rasp. He abandoned the standard Italian used for tourists and businessmen. Instead, he slipped into a dense, archaic dialect, a linguistic relic from the rugged mountains of the Sicilian interior, heavily laced with Sifuni, the coded slang of the old-world Mafia. It was a language of shadows, designed specifically so that even other Italians wouldn't understand the true meaning of the words. "Listen to me, you little bird," he muttered in the dialect, his words thick with glottal stops and sharp, swallowed vowels. "I want the heart of a calf that hasn't seen the sun, cooked in the blood of its own kin. And bring me the vintage from the year the old man in Palermo finally stopped breathing. Not the swill you serve the sheep in the main room." He paused, his eyes gleaming with a cruel light as he watched for a flicker of confusion on Sharon's face. To any other waitress in Manhattan, to almost any linguistic scholar in the country, it would have sounded like a series of harsh, unintelligible grunts. It was a private code for the criminal elite, a way to signal his status while simultaneously making Sharon look like a fool who couldn't even record a simple order. One of his associates smirked, leaning toward Sharon. "Well? Did you get that, sweetheart? Or do we need to draw it for you?" Sharon felt the old fire. The one she had spent 3 years dousing with the cold water of necessity, flicker back to life in her gut. She knew exactly what he had asked for, and she knew the insult hidden in the grammar of his request. He wasn't just ordering food, he was asserting that she was a subhuman obstacle in his territory. She tightened her grip on her pen. She could feel the weight of her family's bills, the fear of the blacklist, and the safety of her silence. But as Vittorino's smirk grew, confident in her ignorance, the mask of the simple waitress began to feel like it was cracking. Vittorino's smirk sharpened, his eyes tracking the slight tension in Sharon's jaw. He was enjoying this, the silence of a woman he believed was drowning in the deep end of a conversation she couldn't comprehend. He leaned closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and sharp citrus cologne cutting through the restaurant's aroma of truffle and wine. "Did you catch all that, Kara?" he asked in English, his voice a mocking purr. "Or should I simplify it for the help?" Before she could respond, he turned back to his associates, his voice rising as he returned to that jagged, archaic Sicilian dialect. "Look at her," he sneered, gesturing toward Sharon with a flick of his gold-ringed hand. "She stands there like a doll with a broken spring. This is the problem with this city. They hire these empty-headed animals to serve kings, and we're expected to treat them as if they have souls." The men at the table chuckled, their eyes gleaming with the reflected gold of the wall sconces. Vittorino wasn't done. He wanted to twist the knife, to ensure the humiliation was absolute before he even took a bite of his meal. "Listen again, since your brain is likely as slow as your service," he barked, slipping back into the dense slang of the Sifuni. "I want the sanguinaccio prepared the old way, with the bitter blood of a pig slaughtered at dawn, not this watered-down filth you keep in the back for the tourists. And I want the wine from the hidden cellar, the one your manager keeps for men who actually matter. If a single drop is served at the wrong temperature, I'll make sure you're scrubbing floors in a dive bar by midnight." He leaned back, crossing his arms over his silk waistcoat. The air around the table felt suffocating, charged with the casual cruelty of a man who used words like a whip. He finished the command with a sharp, linguistic insult, a specific, derogatory term used in the Sicilian mountains to describe a woman who was nothing more than a beast of burden. It was a word so foul, so deeply rooted in the history of his criminal culture, that it was never spoken in polite company. He stared at Sharon, his smirk challenging her to blink, to falter, to show any sign that she felt the weight of the air he had just poisoned. He was certain he was safe behind the barrier of his language, a king speaking from a throne of secrets. "Well?" Vittorino prompted, his voice returning to a smooth, dangerous English. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you going to go fetch what I ordered? Or do I need to speak to your manager about finding someone with a bit more intellectual capacity?" He tapped his signet ring against the table, the metallic clack echoing like a gavel. The challenge was set. He had laid out his trap, built from the bones of a dead dialect and the arrogance of a man who thought he was the only one in the room with a history. He waited for her to stammer, to apologize, to scurry away in confusion. He waited for the break in her professional mask that would signal his total victory. Sharon's grip on her notepad was so firm her knuckles had turned a ghostly white, but her face remained a calm, impenetrable sea. The silence between them wasn't the silence of the confused, it was the silence of a linguist who had just heard a confession. The metallic clack of Vittorino's ring against the table vibrated through the soles of Sharon's shoes, sounding like the closing of a cell door. For 3 years, she had lived in the quietest corners of her own mind, building a fortress out of silence. She had let managers berate her, customers ignore her, and the world forget her name, all to protect the fragile peace she had bought for her family. Every time she swallowed an insult, she told herself it was a small price to pay for her father's medicine and her sister's future. But as she stood under the amber glow of the chandelier, the weight of that silence finally became unbearable. Vittorino wasn't just asking for a meal, he was trying to strip away the last shred of dignity she had left. He was using her own greatest passion, the intricate, beautiful history of human language, to transform her into a beast of burden. She thought of the State Department office she had been forced to vacate, the boxes of her life packed in under an hour while colleagues she had called friends avoided her gaze. She thought of the long nights spent studying the shifting phonetics of Mediterranean dialects, not for a paycheck, but because she loved the way a single word could carry the history of 1,000 years. She had spent her life learning to understand people, and here was a man who believed she wasn't even worth the effort of a glance. A strange, cold clarity washed over her. The internal ledger she had been keeping, the one that prioritized survival over self-respect, suddenly balanced itself. If she stayed silent now, she wasn't just protecting her family, she was killing the woman who made that protection possible. She realized that the simple waitress mask wasn't a shield anymore. It was a shroud. Vittorino's smirk remained fixed, a statue of arrogance waiting for her to break. His associates were already looking away, bored with the one-sided conquest. They expected her to stammer, to fetch the manager, or to simply nod and scurry toward the kitchen in a cloud of confusion. Sharon felt the pins in her bun, the ones holding her hair in that tight, professional knot. They felt like they were holding back a tidal wave. She took a single, deep breath, letting the scent of the restaurant's expensive truffle oil ground her. She didn't look at Marcus, the manager, who was watching anxiously from the bar. She didn't look at the other tables. She looked directly into Vittorino's eyes. The cautious, slightly dazed expression she had worn for 3 years vanished. In its place was the sharp, piercing gaze of a woman who had once briefed ambassadors on the nuances of international threats. The air between them didn't just feel heavy, it felt electric. She realized that by using the Sifuni dialect, Vittorino hadn't just insulted her, he had given her the keys to his kingdom. He had assumed no one in this gold-plated cage was capable of hearing him. He was wrong. Sharon lowered her notepad. She didn't need it anymore. The broken spring in the doll he had mocked had just snapped back into place, and for the first time in 1,000 days, Sharon Hopkins felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Sharon didn't lower her gaze. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in just an inch, invading the space Vittorino thought was his exclusive territory. When she spoke, the voice that emerged wasn't the soft, breathy tone of a waitress seeking a tip, it was a blade of pure, obsidian glass. She spoke in his dialect, not the watered-down version used by street thugs in Palermo, but the ancient, razor-sharp Sifuni of the mountain families, a dialect so precise it made Vittorino's own speech sound like a clumsy imitation. "Your grammar is as sloppy as your manners, Don Venezia," she said, the words rattling in her throat with the authentic, gravelly cadence of the Sicilian interior. "If you're going to demand sanguinaccio prepared the old way, you should at least have the decency to use the correct subjunctive. And as for the pig slaughtered at dawn? In the village you're pretending to come from, they haven't used dawn blood since the late 80s. It's a peasant's myth, used to distract city boys like you while the real men handle the harvest." The silence that hit the table was physical. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Vittorino's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated. His jaw didn't drop, it locked, his muscles frozen in a grotesque mask of shock. The gold signet ring he had been tapping stayed pressed against the linen, his hands suddenly trembling. Sharon didn't stop. She turned her gaze to his associates, who sat like statues, their mouths slightly agape. "And as for the wine," she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous, conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to the neighboring tables. "The hidden cellar you're so proud of is currently holding a 1998 Nero d'Avola that has been corked for 3 months. If I served it to you at the right temperature, you'd spend your evening tasting vinegar and regret." But then again, a man who uses the word for beast of burden to describe a woman who is currently holding his entire reputation in her hands clearly doesn't have the palate to tell the difference. She leaned back then, smoothing her black blazer with a slow, deliberate motion. She used the specific, archaic closing phrase of the dialect, a linguistic signature that meant, "I have seen your soul and found it lacking." The entire restaurant seemed to have tilted on its axis. The background chatter of Loro had ceased completely. The wealthy diners at the next table were staring, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Marcus, the manager, stood by the bar with a bottle of sparkling water in his hand, looking as if he had just seen a ghost speak. Vittorino looked up at her, his face turning a mottled, angry purple, but the fire in his eyes was eclipsed by a burgeoning, panicked realization. This wasn't just a waitress who spoke his language. This was someone who knew the codes, the history, and the subtle, lethal insults of a world he thought was his secret fortress. What are you?" He stammered in English, his voice cracking. The king suddenly stripped of his robes and left shivering in the light of Sharon's brilliance. Sharon merely clicked her pen, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "I'm the person who's going to bring you a glass of water," she said, her voice returning to a terrifyingly polite professional calm. "Because you look like you're about to choke on your own pride." The silence that had gripped the room didn't just break, it shattered. For a heartbeat, Vittorino sat paralyzed, his face a ghostly pale before the blood rushed back in a violent, mottled crimson. The realization that a woman he viewed as a SE had not only understood his criminal shorthand but had dissected his heritage with the precision of a surgeon was too much for his ego to bear. His hand blurred. With a snarl that sounded more animal than human, Vittorino swept his arm across the table. The crystal wine glasses, the heavy silver cutlery, and the porcelain plates were sent flying. The sound of breaking glass echoed like gunfire against the gold-leafed walls. Screams erupted from nearby tables as diners scrambled back, but Sharon didn't move. She stood like a statue amidst the debris, a single shard of glass skittering across the floor to rest at the toe of her sensible work shoe. "You think you're clever?" Vittorino hissed, lunging to his feet. He was shaking, his predatory grace replaced by a raw, vibrating malice. He leaned over the ruined table, his face inches from hers. "You think because you can mimic the tongue of men that you are one of us? You are a ghost, girl. A nothing. I could have your life erased before you clock out for the night." His associates were up now, too, their hands disappearing beneath their jackets in a synchronized, lethal movement. The atmosphere of the luxury restaurant vanished, replaced by the cold, suffocating air of a back-alley execution. Marcus, the manager, was frozen by the bar, his face white, his phone trembling in his hand. He knew better than to intervene when a man like Venezia was hunting. Vittorino reached out, his thick fingers grabbing Sharon's jaw, forcing her to look at the darkness in his eyes. "I don't care who you were before you ended up in this apron," he spat, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "In this city, I am the law. You made a mistake today. You chose a moment of pride over your life. Do you have any idea what happens to people who hear things they aren't supposed to hear?" Sharon felt the bite of his signet ring against her skin, the physical manifestation of his bullying power. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to choke her, but she refused to let her eyes well up. She had spent 3 years being afraid of shadows, and now that the monster was standing in the light, she found she had no more room for terror. "I know exactly what happens," Sharon whispered, her voice steady despite the pressure on her jaw. "But you're forgetting one thing, Vittorino. You aren't in the mountains anymore. And you aren't the only one who's been watching this table tonight." Vittorino's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening. "Is that right? And who is going to stop me? This manager? These sheep eating their dinner?" He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound, but it died in his throat when a shadow fell across the table. A man Sharon had noticed earlier, a well-dressed figure who had been quietly enjoying a vintage red, now stood a few feet away. He wasn't shouting or reaching for a weapon, he was simply watching with the calm, detached gaze of a man who had seen far worse than a temperamental mobster. "Let her go, Vittorino," the stranger said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the gunman pause. "You've already caused enough of a scene. Any more, and you'll make it impossible for your friends in the precinct to look the other way." Vittorino turned his head, his lip curling. "And who the hell are you?" The stranger smiled, a slow, knowing expression that made the air in the room feel even colder. "A fan of linguistics," he replied. "And someone who thinks this lady's talents are being wasted on a man who can't appreciate a perfect retort." Vittorino's hand dropped from Sharon's face, but the threat in his eyes remained. He looked from the stranger back to Sharon, the promise of violence lingering like a scent in the air. He was a cornered animal, and Sharon knew that the most dangerous moment wasn't over, it was just beginning. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Vittorino Venezia stood frozen between two worlds, the public stage of a five-star restaurant and the private violence of his own making. He looked at the stranger, then back at Sharon, his hands still trembling with a fury that had nowhere to go. The stranger didn't wait for the mobster to find his voice. He took a single step forward, and as he did, the casual air of a diner fell away, replaced by an authority that made the air feel thin. "Sit down, Vittorino," the man said, his voice flat and final. "You've already provided enough entertainment for one evening. Your men can put their toys away, too. There are 3 teams outside who would love an excuse to come in here and assist with the check." Vittorino's eyes darted to the window, then back to the man. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He signaled his men with a sharp, jerky nod, and they stepped back, though their hands remained near their jackets. Vittorino sank into his chair, the king suddenly looking very small amidst the wreckage of broken porcelain and spilled wine. The stranger turned to Sharon. He didn't look at her like a waitress. He looked at her as a peer. "That was quite a performance, Miss Hopkins. Or should I say, Senior Analyst Hopkins." Sharon felt the breath leave her lungs. The name, the title, it felt like a ghost reaching out to touch her. "How do you know that name?" she whispered, her voice finally cracking under the weight of the night. The man pulled a small leather wallet from his jacket and flipped it open just enough for her to see a glimmer of silver and a familiar seal. "Agent Sterling. Interagency Task Force. We've been tracking the Venezia family for 18 months, trying to find a way past the dialect they use for their high-level logistics. We knew it was archaic, but we lacked a specialist who could navigate the nuances of the Sifuni slang without being detected." He stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "I was in Brussels when they scapegoated you, Sharon. I knew it was a setup, but I didn't have the leverage to stop it then. I've spent the last year looking for you. I didn't expect to find you pouring Nero Diavola in Manhattan." Sharon looked down at her hands, still clutching the notepad. The ink on the page was smudged with water from the shattered glasses. "I'm not that person anymore, Agent Sterling. I'm just trying to pay the bills. The woman I just saw defend herself isn't just anything," Sterling replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plain white business card. There was no name on it, only a phone number and a localized encryption code. "Venezia thinks he owns this city, but he's just a symptom. We need a cure. We need someone who can listen to the shadows and tell us exactly what they're saying. We need your voice back, Sharon." He looked at the manager, who was still paralyzed by the bar, then back to her. "The apron has served its purpose. It's kept you safe, but it's also kept you small. You can stay here and wait for Venezia to send someone back after the lights go out, or you can walk out that door with me and start rebuilding the career they stole from you." Sharon looked at the card, then at the man who had tried to humiliate her. For the first time in 3 years, the future didn't look like a ledger of debt. It looked like a mission. She reached out, her fingers steady as she took the card. "I'll need to make a call first," she said. Sterling smiled. "Of course. Use my car. We have a lot of work to do." The transition from the gold-leafed confines of Loro to the sterile, blue-lit hum of the Task Force Command Center felt like waking from a long, feverish dream. Sharon stood before a biometric scanner, her heart hammering a rhythm of anticipation she hadn't felt in 3 years. As the laser swept across her iris, a soft chime echoed through the hallway, and the word "cleared" flashed in bold, emerald letters. For the first time since her betrayal, the weight in her chest didn't feel like lead. It felt like purpose. Walking into the high-security suite, she found Agent Sterling waiting by a glass wall covered in digital mapping. He handed her a lanyard. Attached to it was a silver-rimmed badge with her name, Sharon J. Hopkins, Senior Linguistic Lead. "Welcome back to the field, Sharon," Sterling said, his voice grounded and respectful. "The paperwork for the restoration of your full pension and back pay is already moving through Treasury. But right now, we need what's in your head." Sharon sat at a workstation, her fingers hovering over a keyboard. She didn't need to consult a notepad. For months, she had been a human recorder, absorbing every whispered confidence and coded threat that drifted across the tables of the restaurant. While the world saw a waitress refilling water, Sharon had been documenting the heartbeat of a criminal empire. "Venezia wasn't just there for dinner," Sharon began, her voice gaining the sharp, analytical edge that had once made her a legend in Brussels. She began typing, her fingers flying as she translated the jagged fragments of Sifuni she had intercepted over the last 12 weeks. He was coordinating a shipment through the port of Newark. They aren't using standard shipping manifests anymore. They're using a system based on archaic Italian agricultural terms. Words for harvest cycles and livestock rotations to represent specific narcotics and weight. She pulled up a digital map of the tri-state area and highlighted a series of warehouses. "I heard him talking to his associates 3 weeks ago. He mentioned the winter wheat arriving at the northern silo. At the time, I thought he was eccentric. But in the context of the dialect I heard tonight, he was referring to a high-purity shipment arriving at a cold storage facility in Secaucus." Sterling watched as the data populated the screen, connecting dots that the task force had been chasing for a year. "You're giving us the Rosetta Stone, Sharon." "I'm giving you his head on a platter," she corrected, her eyes reflecting the glowing data. As she worked, she felt the last remnants of the simple waitress mask fall away. She wasn't hiding anymore. She spent the next 6 hours cross-referencing names she'd heard mentioned in passing with federal watch lists, building a web of evidence that reached far beyond the dining room of Loro. By dawn, the file was complete. It was a masterpiece of intelligence, a roadmap to the destruction of the Venezia family. Sharon leaned back, the cool air of the command center a balm against her skin. She looked at her badge, then at the sunrise bleeding through the office windows. The debt was being repaid, the family was safe, and for the first time in 1,000 days, the person staring back from the reflective glass was someone she finally recognized. The interrogation room was a stark contrast to the gold-accented luxury of the restaurant. Here, there were no silk waistcoats or scent of truffle oil, only the cold, sterile smell of industrial cleaner and the hum of a recording system that never slept. Vittorino Venezia sat on the bolted-down steel chair, his sharp three-piece suit looking wrinkled and out of place in the harsh fluorescent light. He still wore his mask of arrogance, leaning back with a forced smirk, though the sweat at his temples betrayed him. "I told your boys already," Vittorino rasped, his voice echoing against the cinderblock walls. "I don't talk to suits. I want my lawyer, and I want a glass of something that didn't come from a tap." The heavy steel door behind him groaned open. Vittorino didn't bother to turn around. "Is that you, Sterling? You're wasting your time. You have nothing. Actually, a voice replied, a voice that made the air in the room instantly turn to ice. "We have everything." Vittorino froze. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as a woman stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing a server's apron or a neat, tight bun. Her blonde hair fell in soft, professional waves around her shoulders, and she wore a tailored navy blazer with a silver badge clipped to the lapel. In her hands, she carried a thick, leather-bound file. Sharon Hopkins sat down across from him, her movements calm and authoritative. She didn't look like a girl trying to pay the bills, she looked like the person who held his life in her hands. She opened the file, revealing the shipping manifests, the shell company transfers, and the decrypted logs of his Sifuni conversations. "I believe you were looking for the winter wheat, Vittorino," Sharon said, her voice a low, dangerous melody. She leaned forward, the same way she had at table 1, but this time, the power shift was absolute. "The northern silo in Secaucus was raided 2 hours ago. Your associates are currently being processed in 3 different states. And that 1998 Nero Diavola you wanted? It turns out the vineyard owner was more than happy to explain how you used his estate to launder your Newark profits." Vittorino's face went from pale to a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at the evidence, then at the woman he had called an empty-headed animal. The silence in the room was deafening, a mirror of the moment he had frozen at her retort in the restaurant. "How?" he whispered, his bravado finally collapsing. You were just the girl with the notepad." "I was the girl who was listening," Sharon corrected, her gaze steady and piercing. "You thought your language was a shield, but language is only a secret if no one has the intellect to translate it. You chose the wrong target for your entertainment, Vittorino. And now, the bill is due." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table, his formal indictment. Sharon stood up, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a closing gavel. She looked down at him one last time, not with anger, but with the detached pity of a specialist who had successfully closed a case. "Your lawyer is waiting outside," she said, turning toward the door. "But don't worry. I've made sure the prison kitchen knows exactly how you like your meals prepared. Though I suspect the bold way won't taste quite as good behind bars." As the heavy door clicked shut behind her, Sharon stepped into the hallway where Agent Sterling was waiting. She took a deep breath of the cool, recycled air, feeling the sun of a new life rising. The apron was gone, the silence was over, and Sharon Hopkins was finally home.